July 1987 had turned the fields of Branch County, Michigan, the color of old straw, and 19-year-old Mara Bell was already 3 payments behind when her cows began staring at a fence post with a skull painted on it. The post stood at the edge of her western pasture, half swallowed by weeds and leaning toward a drainage ditch. Mara had seen it every morning since inheriting the farm in March. She had never noticed the skull. Her 23 Holsteins had. At feeding time, 6 cows abandoned the hay wagon and faced the post. They stood perfectly still, ears forward, noses lifted. Mara lowered the bale hook. Again. The cows did not move. Neither did Mara. The farm had belonged to her grandfather, Earl Bell, until a heart attack took him at 71. He left her 86 acres, an aging milk barn, a Ford 8N tractor, $30,000 of debt, and one sentence written on the back of an envelope: "Don't trust that west fence." Mara had assumed he meant the fence itself. Now she wondered if he had meant the post. By noon, the local feed dealer had already heard about it. When Mara mentioned the skull over a counter covered with seed catalogs, the owner laughed. Probably some kid's Halloween joke. "It's painted under the dirt. So it's old." The laughter stopped for half a second. Then the dealer shrugged. Old things don't pay bank notes. Mara knew that. Her mortgage payment was due Friday. The milk check had fallen because summer heat was pushing production down. 2 cows were sick. The hay crop looked thin. The bank had sent a man to photograph the barn. Still, she drove home before dark and walked toward the western pasture. The skull was clearer in the evening. It was crude, no bigger than her palm, painted directly onto the post in faded red. 2 round eyes, crooked jaw, for short lines where teeth should have been. Mara touched the wood. Red paint came away on her fingertip, fresh beneath old weathering. Someone had painted over it more than once. That made no sense. Next morning, every cow was staring again. Mara opened the gate. They moved aside as she walked toward the post, but none followed her past the first stretch of grass. She stopped. The ground around the post was unusually green. Not the weeds, the grass. It was dark, thick, and knee-high where the rest of the pasture was yellowing. Mara crouched and pressed her palm into the soil. Cool, damp. She dug one finger down. The earth was wet less than 3 inches below the surface. That was impossible. There had been no rain for 9 days. She stood slowly. Behind her, one of the oldest cows gave a low, uneasy call. Mara looked at the skull again. Then she heard a truck coming up the lane. It was white, with the County Conservation Office emblem on the door. A woman stepped out. She was 35, white, broad-shouldered, and dressed in khaki work clothes with mud on her boots. Her name was Ellen Mercer, the county soil and water technician. Mara knew her reputation. Ellen had a clipboard for everything and an opinion about nearly every farm in the township. Ellen walked straight toward the fence. "I heard you're digging around the west post." "I haven't dug yet." Ellen glanced at the cows. "That's not what I heard." Mara said nothing. Ellen studied the skull. For the first time, her confident expression changed. "Where did you get this?" "It was here." "No." Ellen stepped closer. "I mean, who put it there?" "I don't know." Ellen wiped dirt from the post with 2 fingers. The skull became sharper. Under its jaw was a tiny red number. 17. Ellen stopped breathing for a moment. Mara noticed. "What does 17 mean?" Ellen straightened. "Nothing. That didn't look like nothing. It's an old marking." "For what?" Ellen closed her clipboard. "You should leave this fence alone." Mara looked toward the dry pasture, then at her cows, then at the green grass around the skull-marked post. "Why?" Ellen hesitated. "Because your grandfather asked the same question 26 years ago." Mara felt the words land harder than any warning. "Earl knew about this?" Ellen turned toward her truck. "He knew enough to stop digging." "Where did he dig?" Ellen paused with one hand on the door. She did not answer. Instead, she looked back at the cows. They weren't doing that in 1961. Mara frowned. What happened in 1961? Ellen started the engine. Ask your grandmother." Then she drove away. Mara stood alone beside the fence. The cows remained fixed on the skull. Mara waited until the truck disappeared beyond the cottonwoods before kneeling again. She pushed her fingers deeper into the soil. Water gathered against her knuckles. There was another detail. The moisture smelled metallic, like old iron. She scraped away a thin layer of grass and found a narrow line of blackened stones running toward the post. Not a pipe. Not exactly. The stones formed a shallow channel, almost hidden beneath the roots. Her grandfather had taught her to notice things before he taught her to repair them. "Land talks," he used to say. "Most people are just too busy answering it." Mara had thought that was an old man's poetry. Now she wasn't so sure. She walked back to the barn and started the Ford 8N. The tractor coughed twice before catching, its blue-gray exhaust hanging beneath the roof. She parked beside the tool shed and found Earl's old steel digging bar. At the bottom of the bar, scratched into the handle, were 3 numbers. 17. Mara stared at them. Then she looked toward the western pasture. The cows were still facing the skull. She picked up the bar. She would find what her grandfather had feared. Mara carried the steel digging bar across the pasture just before sunset. The cows watched her. Not the bar. Not the fence. The skull. She stopped 6 feet from the post and studied the ground again. The green patch was larger than it had been that morning. Water had seeped through a crack beside the post, leaving a dark crescent in the dirt. Mara touched it. Cold. She looked toward the dry pond behind the barn. It had been empty since June. Something underground was moving. But why here? She drove the steel bar into the earth. Thunk. The sound was wrong. Too hollow. Mara lifted the bar and struck again. Thunk. She dug around the post with a spade, careful not to damage the roots of the grass. 6 inches down, she found a layer of flat stones. At 10 inches, the soil became almost black. At 14 inches, the shovel struck metal. Mara froze. She brushed away the dirt with both hands. A narrow iron plate appeared beneath the roots. It was rusted almost completely through. On its surface was another skull. This one wasn't painted. It had been stamped into the metal, and beneath it were the same 3 numbers. 17. Mara sat back on her heels. Her grandfather's envelope was still in the kitchen. "Don't trust that west fence." She had read the sentence dozens of times. Now she wondered if it had never been about the fence. Maybe it had been about what the fence was hiding. She carried the iron plate to the farmhouse. The kitchen clock said 8:17. Mara stared at it. Then she laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly she was beginning to feel watched by numbers. She called her grandmother. Earl's widow, Ruth Bell, was 78 and lived 12 miles away in Coldwater. She answered after the 4th ring. "Mara." "Grandma." "What happened in 1961? Silence. Mara heard a cabinet door close on the other end. "Why are you asking?" "I found the skull." Another silence. This one lasted longer. Then Ruth said quietly, "Your grandfather told you not to dig. He told me not to trust the west fence." That was his way of saying it. Mara looked at the iron plate. "What is 17? Ruth breathed in slowly. "Earl called it the 17 line." "What line?" "The old drainage line." Mara waited. Ruth continued. "In 1961, the county widened the road west of your property. They changed the drainage ditch. After that, 3 farms started flooding underground." Underground. Water doesn't always show itself where it's moving. Mara glanced through the kitchen window. The pasture was dark, but she could still see the cows gathered around the fence. Ruth lowered her voice. "Your grandfather found an old clay drainage tile under that pasture. He said somebody had deliberately blocked it." "Why? I never knew." "You did." Ruth sighed. "I knew Earl was afraid of someone." "Who?" "I don't know." That answer sounded rehearsed. Mara pushed. "Grandma." Ruth finally said, "Ask Ellen Mercer." Mara remembered Ellen's face when she'd seen the skull. She wasn't surprised. She was scared. The next morning, Mara drove to the county office. Ellen was standing beside a filing cabinet when Mara entered. "You shouldn't have dug. I found an iron plate." Ellen stopped. "Where?" "Under the skull." Ellen closed her eyes. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Ellen pulled a chair away from the desk. "Sit down." Mara didn't. "Tell me what 17 means." Ellen looked toward the window. The original survey called that drainage corridor line 17. Drainage corridor? A buried agricultural drainage system. Then why is there a skull? Ellen rubbed her forehead. Because in 1961, someone discovered chemicals in the drainage water. Mara's stomach tightened. What chemicals? Pesticide runoff. From where? Ellen didn't answer immediately. An orchard operation north of your grandfather's land. Mara knew the orchard. Everyone did. Bell Orchard had once been the largest apple operation in the county. Her grandfather had worked there before buying his farm. What happened? The orchard closed. Why? Cattle started getting sick. Mara stared at her. Her cows. The staring. The wet ground. The skull. Suddenly the pieces seemed connected. Ellen shook her head. Don't jump ahead. What did they find? Nothing they could prove. Then why did my grandfather dig? Because he didn't believe them. Ellen opened a drawer and removed a yellowed county map. She unfolded it across the desk. A blue line ran beneath Mara's property. It crossed directly beneath the western fence. Then it continued toward the old orchard. Ellen placed her finger on the skull-marked post. That's where line 17 disappears. Mara looked at her. Disappears? It was supposed to continue south. But it doesn't. No. Where does it go? Ellen tapped the map. That's what nobody knows. The office door opened. A man in a gray suit stepped inside. He was 49, clean-shaven, and carried a leather briefcase. Mara recognized him immediately. Calvin Price, the banker handling her farm loan. He smiled politely. Miss Bell. Mara folded the map. What are you doing here? Your payment is due Friday. I know. I've arranged a meeting. I'll make the payment. Calvin glanced at Ellen, then at the map. His expression changed for less than a second. But Mara saw it. He knew about line 17. You've been digging, he said. Mara didn't answer. Calvin stepped closer. That pasture isn't worth risking your farm over. Why? Because some things are buried for a reason. Mara felt the room go cold. Ellen looked at him. Calvin. He ignored her. You have until Friday. Then he left. Mara turned toward Ellen. Why does my banker know about a drainage line? Ellen didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the window. Outside, Calvin's car rolled away. Ellen watched it disappear. Then she whispered, because his father owned the orchard. That night, a thunderstorm rolled over Branch County. Mara stood in the barn doorway as rain hammered the tin roof. For the first time in weeks, the pasture drank. Water streamed into the drainage ditch. But around the skull-marked post, something strange happened. The water didn't flow toward the ditch. It disappeared into the ground. Mara grabbed her lantern. She walked through the rain. The cows were already there. Every single one of them. The red skull glistened beneath the rain. Mara knelt. A thin stream of muddy water emerged from beneath the post. Then something metallic surfaced. She pulled at it. A rusted chain came free. At the end of the chain was a small iron ring. Mara wrapped both hands around it. She pulled. The ground shifted. And beneath the fence post, something much larger moved. Mara stared into the darkness between the roots. There was a hollow space underneath her pasture, and something inside it had just moved. Mara did not pull the ring again. She stood in the rain with one hand wrapped around the rusted chain and listened to the hollow space beneath the fence. Something dripped below her. Then came a faint metallic scrape. The cows shifted behind her. One of them lowed sharply. Mara stepped backward. She knew enough about old farms to understand one thing. A hollow beneath a pasture was never an accident. The next morning, she returned with the Ford 8N. The tractor had belonged to Earl for 34 years. Its paint was faded, The seat was patched with black tape, and the engine coughed whenever Mara asked it to climb a hill. But it started. One crank. Earl had always claimed that meant the tractor trusted her. Mara parked 20 feet from the fence. She removed the post with a pry bar. The wood came loose easier than it should have. Beneath it was a square opening. Not large, about 3 feet across. The chain disappeared into darkness. Mara lowered a lantern. The light revealed a stone-lined shaft descending roughly 6 feet. At the bottom was an old clay drainage tile, cracked down the middle. Water was flowing through it. Mara stared. The technical answer came to her slowly. Old farms in southern Michigan often used buried clay tile to drain saturated fields. The tiles were laid end-to-end beneath the soil. Water entered through tiny gaps between them and traveled downhill by gravity. The system did not need a pump. The land itself supplied the pressure. And if one section became blocked, water could travel sideways until it found another opening. That explained the green grass. It explained the damp soil. It explained why the cows kept returning. The cows weren't seeing the skull. They were smelling the water beneath it. But that raised a much bigger question. Why had someone placed a skull on the post above the drainage line? Mara climbed down. At the bottom, she found the old clay tile had been deliberately packed with gravel. Someone had blocked it. She removed one handful, then another. Black water trickled through. The smell was sharp, not rotten, chemical. Mara climbed out immediately. She ran to the farmhouse and called Ellen. The county technician arrived 40 minutes later. She crouched beside the opening. "Don't touch the water again." Mara nodded. Ellen examined the exposed tile. This was intentionally blocked. "I know." "No, Mara." Ellen pointed deeper into the shaft. "Look." A second pipe crossed beneath the first. Modern PVC. Newer. Probably installed in the 1970s. Mara frowned. Why would someone put a new pipe beside an old drainage line? Ellen looked toward the orchard road. Because someone redirected the water. Mara felt the pieces tightening. The old orchard. The sick cattle. The drainage line. The skull. Calvin Price. Where does the new pipe go? Ellen didn't answer. She pulled the county map from her truck. They traced the line. It ran beneath Mara's pasture, then crossed the property boundary, then disappeared beneath the abandoned orchard. Ellen suddenly stood. "I need another map." She drove back to the office. Mara stayed beside the opening. For the first time, she noticed something carved into the inside wall of the shaft. A date, 1961. Below it were initials, E.B. Earl Bell. Her grandfather had been here, but there was another set of initials beneath his. CP. Mara's stomach dropped. Calvin Price's father. She took a photograph. Then she heard tires on gravel. Calvin's truck appeared at the top of the lane. He walked toward her without an umbrella. "You shouldn't be here." Mara stood. "You knew." Calvin's face tightened. "Knew what?" "My grandfather found this." He looked down into the shaft. For the first time, the polished banker looked old. "My father told me never to talk about 1961. Why?" "He said the farm would be ruined if the truth came out." Mara stepped closer. "What truth?" Calvin stared at the skull-marked post. Then he said, "The cattle didn't die from disease. The rainwater dripped from his hat." Mara waited. "What happened to them?" "Your grandfather believed the orchard's chemical runoff was being diverted through your land." "And was it?" Calvin looked away. "My father denied it." "That isn't an answer." "No." He swallowed. "It isn't." Before Mara could press him, a truck horn sounded from the road. Ellen returned. She carried 3 maps and a paper file. She opened the oldest map on the hood of her truck. The original drainage corridor was marked in blue. The modern one was marked in red. But there was something else. Penciled line. It started at the skull-marked post. It ran beneath Mara's pasture. Then it curved toward the abandoned orchard. And stopped at a structure that no longer existed. Concrete settling basin. Ellen looked at Mara. "Your grandfather wasn't trying to find what was buried." Mara stared at the map. He was trying to prove where the water went. Calvin stepped backward. Ellen looked at him. And his father knew. Nobody spoke. Then Mara remembered the envelope. Don't trust that west fence. She had thought it was a warning. It wasn't. It was an instruction. The fence was the only place where the buried drainage system could still be reached. Mara suddenly understood why the cows had found it. The pasture was drying everywhere else. But the old drainage channel was carrying water beneath the grass. The cows had followed the moisture. Nature had remembered what the county maps had forgotten. Mara returned to the opening. She removed another handful of gravel from the old tile. Water began flowing faster. The green grass around the post trembled beneath the rain. Then the farmer heard something beneath the earth. A deep rushing sound. Ellen stepped closer. What is that? Mara didn't answer. The water level inside the shaft began falling. The blocked drainage line was opening. And somewhere beneath the pasture, an old underground system had suddenly come back to life. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the western field began to sink. Not dramatically, just a few inches, but enough for Mara to see a rectangular depression forming beneath the rain. Ellen's face went pale. There's a structure under there. Mara grabbed the shovel. Calvin backed away. Mara, don't. She looked at him. Why? He didn't answer. Because the ground had already answered for him. A corner of an old concrete roof was breaking through the pasture. And painted across it, in the same faded red as the skull on the fence post, was a second warning. 17. By sunrise, the rain had stopped. Mara stood beside the collapsed section of pasture with mud up to her knees. The concrete structure beneath the field was no longer a mystery. It was an old settling basin, roughly 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, built in 1961 when the county drainage system had been changed. The roof had collapsed inward decades earlier, but the walls were still intact. Ellen climbed down first. Mara followed. The air smelled of wet clay, rust, and something faintly chemical. Along the wall were rows of old glass sample bottles. Most were broken. 3 were still sealed. Each carried a handwritten date. July 1961. Mara picked one up. Ellen stopped her. Don't open it. I wasn't going to. Mara turned the bottle toward the light. Beneath the date was a name. Bell Orchard. Then she saw the second line. Water diverted through Bell Farm. Mara stared at it. Her grandfather had not been imagining anything. Someone had deliberately redirected contaminated drainage water beneath his property. The skull on the fence wasn't a threat to her. It was a warning from him. A warning that had survived 26 years of weather, farming, and neglect. Mara climbed out of the basin and walked back to the fence post. The red skull was nearly invisible beneath the morning mud. She wiped it clean. Then she noticed something she had missed before. The skull wasn't facing the road. It wasn't facing the house. It was facing the pasture, toward the place where the buried basin sat. Mara understood. The mark wasn't telling people to stay away from the post. It was pointing them toward what lay beneath it. Her grandfather had left a trail. He simply hadn't lived long enough to finish it. Ellen contacted the state environmental office. By noon, 2 inspectors arrived. One was a gray-haired man named Harold Vance, 61, who had worked agricultural contamination cases since the 1970s. He examined the bottles, then the drainage tile, then the old maps. Finally, he looked at Mara. Where did you find all this? She pointed toward the fence. The cows kept staring at it. Harold looked at the cows. Several were standing around the skull-marked post again. He smiled faintly. Animals notice water before people do. That sentence stayed with Mara. The inspectors tested the water. The old contamination had largely broken down over the decades, but the evidence was enough to establish what had happened in 1961. The orchard's drainage system had been redirected into the Bell Farm's underground tile. The resulting runoff had entered the pasture drainage system. Several farms downstream had experienced livestock illness. The records had been buried. Not lost, buried. Mara finally understood why Calvin's father had been so afraid. The evidence didn't just expose an old mistake. It exposed an intentional decision. And that changed everything. The county reopened the original investigation. The bank delayed foreclosure. Then something unexpected happened. The old drainage basin became useful again. Once the contaminated section was isolated and the damaged tile repaired, water began moving through the pasture naturally. Mara didn't need an expensive irrigation system. She needed the system her grandfather had inherited. She and Ellen repaired the old clay tile with modern couplers where necessary, leaving the functioning sections intact. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow. It was dirty. But it worked. By October, the western pasture was green again. The cows stopped crowding around the fence. Not because the mystery had disappeared, because the water was flowing where it was supposed to flow. Mara planted a small rotation of alfalfa and orchard grass. The next spring, she expanded the herd. Calvin Price came to the farm one afternoon. He stood beside the fence. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he removed his hat. "My father knew." Mara looked at him. "He knew the drainage was being redirected." Calvin nodded. "I didn't. You knew enough to scare me away." He looked down. "I was scared." Mara didn't forgive him immediately, but she didn't need to. The farm was finally moving forward. 2 years later, the old bell pasture had become one of the healthiest pieces of grassland in the township. The county used Mara's repaired drainage system as an example of how old agricultural infrastructure could sometimes be restored instead of replaced. Ellen became a regular visitor, not as an inspector, as a friend. The Ford 8N still worked. Its paint remained faded. Its rear tire still had a patch. But Mara kept it. She said the tractor had earned its retirement. It never got one. 5 years after the discovery, Mara was 24. She had paid off the farm loan. She had expanded from 23 cows to 51. The western pasture was no longer the neglected corner of the property. It was the most productive, and the fence post remained. Mara never replaced it. She reinforced the bottom with a treated brace and left the skull visible. People asked why. She always gave the same answer. Because somebody tried to hide the truth. The county held a small agricultural history meeting in 1994. Harold Vance attended. So did Ellen. Calvin Price stood near the back. Mara was asked to speak about the farm's drainage system. She hated public speaking, so she kept it simple. The land told us where the water was going. That was all. Nobody laughed. Afterward, Calvin approached her. "I owe you an apology." Mara looked at him. "For what?" "For telling you some things were buried for a reason." She glanced toward the old fence outside. "They were." Calvin nodded. "But they weren't buried to stay hidden forever." Mara smiled slightly. "No." She walked away. The farm eventually became part of a larger conservation project. The old orchard was replanted. The drainage corridor was mapped. The settling basin was preserved. And the skull-marked fence post became the strangest piece of history on the property. But Mara never forgot what happened that first summer. She had been 19. She had inherited debt instead of security. She had a failing pasture, an aging tractor, and cows that seemed obsessed with a piece of wood nobody else noticed. People had called the skull a prank, then a warning, then evidence. But Mara understood something different. It had been a memory, a small red reminder left behind by someone who knew the land could eventually tell the truth. 10 years later, the farm looked completely different. The barn had been repaired. The herd had grown. The western pasture stretched green toward the trees. Children from neighboring farms sometimes visited to see the old drainage basin. Ellen, now in her 40s, still stopped by every spring. The Ford 8N still started on one crank. And the fence post still carried the faded red skull. One October morning, Mara's daughter walked beside her through the pasture. She was 8 years old. "Mom," she asked, "why is there a skull on that post?" Mara looked at the cows. They were grazing peacefully. She smiled. "Because sometimes the land remembers what people forget." Her daughter touched the weathered wood. Then she looked down. A small patch of grass beneath the post was bright green. Even in October, Mara noticed it. She stopped. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled. The old drainage line was still carrying water beneath the pasture. The farm was still listening. And this time, nobody needed a warning. The cows simply lowered their heads and grazed as morning mist settled over the green field. The red skull remained on the old fence post. The Ford 8N rested beside the barn. And beneath the quiet Michigan soil, the water kept moving. If this story reminded you of something your family once discovered on an old farm, tell us about it in the comments. Maybe it was a strange fence post, an abandoned machine, an old barn, or something your grandparents knew that everyone else had forgotten. Those quiet pieces of farming history are worth preserving. And if you enjoy stories about young farmers uncovering the secrets hidden in American farmland, stay with us. There is always another field, another old machine, and another mystery waiting just beyond the fence.